A once innocent and seemingly harmless figure, Joshua Block was once known as a TikTok sensation who was, well, for the most part, well liked on the platform. His quirky personality mixed with his active lifestyle and many frequent adventures to places such as New York City and around his Long Island hometown of Medford gained him many eyes around the period from 2020 to 2021. He was a content creator who seemed to always have something interesting going on, and would always have some way of making things interesting for better or worse. You see, Joshua has autism, which can be said to be one of the main contributing factors to his general quirks and behavior. And though this certainly does not pose as a full explanation to his behaviors and actions, as mentioned above, it is definitely a key contributor to his overall quirky behavior, and is an important point to note nonetheless. With that said, however, I digress. Though beginning as innocent, Joshua's demeanor soon began to take a snowballing decline as his fame began to grow larger and larger. Now, many of the details that are to be mentioned within this video have already been covered with my last video on Joshua, the rise and fall of Joshua Block. However, I will still try to do my best to provide a brief summary as to how Joshua began to spiral down the dark path that he finds himself trotting on today, as Joshua began to accumulate more and more fame around early to mid 2021, namely for his videos revolving around his many trips to New York City, as well as his videos of him singing the song Empire State of Mind. He in turn began to develop a sort of cult following around his image, with many people on the streets beginning to recognize him from his content on TikTok. In fact, this fame at one point became so much that fans would often gather in New York City and purchase billboards of Josh within Times Square, usually showcasing his dancing videos to the world to see. This era we could say was around the absolute peak of Joshua's TikTok fame. However, this fame would prove to be too much for the 20-year-old Joshua Block to handle. Around this time, one could say that Joshua found himself wrapped within one of his first minor controversies, which in the spring of 2021, Joshua was clearly getting fed up with being approached in the streets of New York City while on his usual rounds. As a result of this general annoyance, Joshua would announce that if anyone wanted to have a photo or video taken with him, then they would have to pay him $50 first. This put off many fans as they began to see Josh as arrogant and money hungry, with many thinking that the fame was beginning to get to his head around this era. As well, people began to observe a noticeable change within Joshua's behavior around this time, with many beginning to complain that Joshua was beginning to become very rude and unapproachable within real life. In turn, Joshua's newfound agitated attitude began to also rub off on his fans, who began to slowly lose respect for the once tame figure. This also resulted in the beginning of many people beginning to mess around with Josh, as many people's perspectives on Josh began to grow much less sympathetic. And as you could imagine, his community began to become a breeding ground for trolling, and his legacy as a lolcow would begin to be etched into internet history. Around this time also, Joshua found himself entangled in his first real controversy, in which a fan recorded himself giving Josh a fish from a pond, which the fan recording claimed was already dead. Upon hearing this, Joshua decided to take the dead fish and batter it up by throwing it on the ground and stomping on it multiple times. This video enraged fans, with many having questions as to the kind of person Josh really was or was capable of being. Defending himself, Joshua decided to tell his fans his side of the story, in which Joshua stated that he was told that the fish was already dead by the fan in question, and further claimed that the guy in the video was trying to set him up with the fish as an excuse to cancel him. Despite these claims, however, fans were still reasonably disgusted over the situation and had many questions regarding Joshua's credibility within the situation. Joshua later posted several responses and apologies, asking users to forget about the incident and to stop hating on him. Following the fish incident, many began to grow bitter towards Josh, so much so that Joshua began to have many of his followers turn into trolls outright. For example, during one of Joshua's usual rounds within New York City, a fan found the hotel in which Joshua was staying and decided to swat the creator, claiming that he overheard Josh make bomb threats on a live stream of his. Ultimately, this incident resulted in Josh getting kicked out of the hotel he was staying in. Though the fish incident would continue to follow him well into the future, Joshua's presence remained mostly tame for the rest of 2021. The only notable thing about Josh during this period is that he came off as being noticeably more rude and abrasive towards both fans and people in the streets alike. However, this tame streak would soon end in November of 2021, in which Joshua would take his first known trip out of the US to Cancun, Mexico. As mentioned in one of my last videos, this trip revolved around his usual shenanigans, as well as his newfound desire for partying. With Mexico's drinking age being 18 instead of 21, and with Josh being 20 at the time, this was his first introduction to alcohol. As we'll find out later, this introduction to alcohol would soon prove to be detrimental to Joshua's story. It is also important to note that Joshua got so drunk on this trip that he ended up losing his phone in a Cancun taxi. Being away from the internet for 2 weeks and on top of his last video revolving around him drunkenly blaring music while walking up and down a dark beach, many grew worried as to Joshua's whereabouts, with many even suspecting that he was kidnapped or died. Though an unimportant detail, it's still pretty amusing to mention in hindsight. The period from here to August 2022 proved to be fairly mundane, besides Joshua taking a second trip to Cancun and pulling his usual partying shenanigans. However, what's more important within the story is what happened right after Josh turned 21 in August of 2022. Being legal, Josh took his learned Cancun partying antics into the streets in New York City. As soon as he turned 21, Joshua went from partying a decent amount to partying heavily. This trend would only continue to snowball until Joshua's partying antics saw him partying every single day, often for months and months at a time. And of course, with this partying came heavy drinking. For almost every night since this period, fans would observe Joshua drinking heavily every single day of the week. In fact, this drinking got to the point in which Joshua would oftentimes film himself drinking heavily within the early morning hours of the day, and would even regularly drink publicly in places such as Times Square. As we can see, Joshua's autism paired with this addiction and alcoholism would prove to be a powerful yet detrimental combination. From here, Joshua's true spiral is said to begin, and this post-August 2022 alcoholism would go to mark the beginning of a whole new arc for the Joshua Block story entirely, one that would prove much more sinister than before. This is where the true story of Joshua's spiral begins. From this point forward, Joshua would spend most of his days wandering around New York City partying in an aimless state of drunkenness. This alcohol dependency mixed with his desire for any sort of attention and lack of social awareness did not pair well, and could be said to be the culprit of Joshua's many later altercations during his ventures throughout New York City. Around this time also, Joshua met a 62-year-old man named Michael Quinn, who claims to be a multimillionaire who owns a hot dog street vending business in the city, Feltman's of Coney Island. With the age difference between the two of them, many grew concerned when Quinn entered Josh's life, and who was to know exactly what Quinn's intentions with Josh were. As well, many were put off with Quinn's overall narcissistic-like demeanor. It's safe to say that Quinn is a universally detested figure in the Worldoftshirts community for his scamming, clout chasing, and mismanagement of Josh, all while he claims to be, quote, just a great guy, according to himself. It is also often speculated by fans that Quinn's intentions with Josh are much more sinister than meets the eye, and that Josh is actively being groomed by the man. As well, Quinn is also the organizer of Josh's New York City tours, which would soon become a huge source of income for Josh. Fans would pay $40 to walk around New York City accompanied by both Josh and Michael Quinn. Though the tours mostly involved Michael Quinn solely talking about the history of certain areas in New York City, most, if not all, patrons of the tour would solely come to see and meet Josh. Though some fans were genuinely interested in simply meeting and spending time with Josh, many were much more malicious within their intentions on the tours, and would use the tours to further instigate and harass Joshua. But I digress. As said, these tours will mostly be outdoors and more historical in nature, guided solely by Michael Quinn, with a few odd stops in between the duration of the tour at places such as Ray's Candy Store and Stromboli's Pizza, just to name a few places. However, the most noticeable pit stop on the tour would be McSorley's Ale House, a famous bar in New York City in which each tour would end at. As part of the tour, Quinn and Josh would give each of the tour patrons a free drink after the walking part of the tour would conclude. With tours occurring almost every day, this would become a regular pit stop within the Joshua Block story. From here, Joshua's main sources of revenue were from both his tours and online antics, with him making money from donations and TikTok ad revenue mainly. This meant that Joshua's life revolved solely around making content, going on tours, and partying and drinking heavily every single day, with these activities often overlapping directly on top of each other. Though he seemed well off financially, his atrocious spending habits would zero out this financial progress. As well, Joshua was not adequately prepared for fame, and often found himself being harassed by people on the streets as a result of this. This harassment, paired with both his autistic tendencies and being inebriated a good majority of the time, only further worsened his condition and caused him to spiral even further from here. Joshua would also go to make money off of Cameo, which could be said to be one of his most successful financial ventures yet. Joshua started making cameos around 2021 or so, however the success from this was fairly minimal due to his at the time smaller audience size. Despite this, he still managed to accumulate a few $1,000s from this venture, spending it mostly on coffee and boba tea. Though this detail may seem minimal, it's important for later on in the story. Joshua would then have a second round on Cameo in mid-2023, around the peak of his spiraling lifestyle. The second wave on Cameo would go on to generate him tens of thousands of dollars, which he would spend almost entirely on partying in New York City and on impulsive trips to various locations in Europe. Though, many have speculated that these trips were even paid for using his own money, due to Josh's heavy outflow and overall lax lifestyle. One theory that many have is that Joshua used his credit cards to keep pace with his hectic lifestyle, which is somewhat backed up by Joshua himself, as he has before admitted to being in debt. Another theory is that someone else is paying for all of Joshua's excursions, with people almost exclusively suspecting Michael Quinn as being the contributor of this. This theory has neither been confirmed or denied, and many believe that such a relationship between both Quinn and Josh is likely. And lastly, many suspect that Joshua is living off of an inheritance bubble left to him by his late mother, though that much is speculative. However, I digress. Regarding his travels, this brings us to the next part of the Joshua Block story, which involves his frequent travels to Europe starting around early 2023. The first of these trips found Josh visiting both England and Italy respectively. Joshua started his trip in London, which was more of a layover than anything. For Joshua's standards, the trip was mostly uneventful, revolving around his usual explorations of the surrounding areas, but nothing really noteworthy enough to mention. However, a few days later, Joshua made his way to Italy, visiting both Rome and Venice respectively. Joshua's Rome trip was more up to speed with his usual antics, involving a lot of partying, as well as his usual abrasive antics around the city. After arriving home to the US from his trip to Italy, Joshua lost his luggage on his way back home. This instance would lead to a meltdown from Joshua, which was all filmed and live-streamed by Michael Quinn. Many questioned Quinn's demeanor during the instance, and many even went as far to accuse that the whole situation had been pre-orchestrated by Quinn himself. This theory certainly holds merit, as Quinn has changed the storyline multiple times during this incident, stating later that Joshua forgot his luggage in an Uber ride on his way home while drunk. As well, he has said that Joshua left his luggage back at the lobby of his apartment. This inconsistency in the storyline has made many reasonably suspicious, with many believing that Quinn set the whole situation up. It is also important to note that Quinn was also the main point of contact throughout this whole situation. Understandably, this whole situation led to a huge manhunt, with Joshua taking a train out to a random place in New Jersey to meet up with someone who claimed to have the luggage. Ultimately, however, the story ended with Joshua getting his luggage back, with Quinn stating that he dropped off his luggage before leaving to see the Super Bowl, and that he lost his luggage in the Uber he took back to Penn Station, supposedly to go back home to Long Island. Regardless, the story poses as a dubious one and has led to many people suspecting for the worst regarding Quinn's character. Once again, I digress. This trip sparked something in Josh, with him stating frequently afterwards that he wanted to go back, quote, home to Italy. It's also worth noting that this also set off a whole chain reaction of trips after this. Only a few weeks later, Quinn arranged for Josh to take a paid 7-day trip to Naples, Florida. As for the purpose of this trip, Quinn stated that it was rehabilitational in nature. However, many had questions regarding Quinn's true intentions behind this move, and have questions regarding potential ulterior motives. Unfortunately, this trip proved to be anything but rehabilitational, which as expected, revolved heavily around partying and heavy drinking. This is of course being paired with all of his usual antics, such as of course being abrasive as usual and drinking too much to the point of puking on his fans in a live video. Joshua also bought a captain's hat while away in Florida, to pose as a sort of souvenir. Though this detail seems minute, it would prove to be the culprit for the beginning of a new era within the Joshua Block lore. And here marks the beginning of what I would like to call the captain's hat arc. After arriving home from Florida, Joshua began to wear this captain's hat everywhere he went. Nobody knew the exact reason for this, but the hat would virtually never leave Joshua's head, and soon would become a key facet of Joshua's character. Once people began to catch on to this sort of quirky fashion choice, many started to refer to Joshua as, quote, the captain, and with this idea of being a captain would very soon get to Joshua's head. From here on out, Joshua would make multiple videos prancing around New York City, claiming that he was the, quote, captain of the ship. This idea would also go on to instill a new flavor of arrogance within Josh, in which many would begin to take note of. This captain's hat and bold personality made Joshua stick out like a sore thumb, and as expected, people began to notice him in public more and more due to his bizarre appearance and demeanor. From roughly here on out, Joshua would get consistently harassed on the streets of New York City, and really wherever he would go by fans and strangers alike. Of course, this constant attention and oftentimes harassment, mixed with his usual inebriation, would not go on to be a good combination. Joshua would in turn get into frequent altercations with people in the streets, and of course this worsened his overall attitude and condition towards others, only further worsening the issue. For example, one night when heading home on the Long Island Railroad, Joshua live-streamed himself drunkenly ranting about his poor spending habits, repetitively saying that he has, quote, no money and, quote, lives paycheck to paycheck. This followed a prior incident where someone who recognized Josh flicked his captain's hat on the ride home. Joshua claimed that the event was an event of assault and would go on to curse out the guy, threatening to sue him. Regardless, after overhearing Josh's rant after the fact about living paycheck to paycheck and stating that he, quote, did not get paid enough for this, all after making a huge scene, some train car patrons sitting near him began to engage with Josh on this matter. Given that these patrons were likely fans and already knew a bit about Josh's situation, they began to continue to egg him on about various things in a harassing way. For example, when repeatedly ranting about living, quote, paycheck to paycheck, one of the people in question from the group would tell Josh to, quote, get a job, to which set Josh into a fling of uncontrolled rage. Joshua would then go on to yell back at the person in question, calling the person a, quote, unemployed blitch, and threatening to sue them for millions of dollars. As well, these two phrases would go on to be two of Josh's go-to phrases during times of turmoil or harassment on the streets. Around this time, Joshua would also go on to develop a mini obsession with lawsuits and threatening to sue anyone who would either arise his suspicions or engage him directly on the streets. Though many would suspect that Josh has no idea what he was saying, Joshua was seen on stream multiple times ranting about how he could make money off of lawsuits based off of his encounters in his day-to-day life, and would even go on to rant about getting a, quote, Nigerian lawyer for cheap. These ideas were also further egged on by Michael Quinn, and of course are pretty much based within pure delusion. Regardless, this harassment would only further continue, and with Josh in an already weakened state would only go to further worsen his overall condition. For example, while on his usual rounds in the city, Joshua would find himself frequently getting his hat stolen by people in the streets. When his hat would get stolen, it would almost always lead to a full-on meltdown on Joshua's behalf, paired with his usual drunkenness and threats of a loss. At a few points, these meltdowns got pretty severe to the point of full-on mental breakdowns, and these breakdowns only ever seem to get worse with every instance that his hat gets stolen from him. However, his hat is most always given back to him in some way, shape, or form. Around this time also, Joshua would find himself going on a further string of trips all around Europe. Most notably, it was roughly around here that in the summer of 2023 that Joshua would find himself taking 2 separate trips to Iceland for about 2 days at a time, both only a few weeks apart from each other. This first trip is what is most notable, as Joshua would find himself being the target of constant harassment by the locals. For example, as part of the usual fan ritual, Joshua had his hat stolen from him yet again during this first trip to Iceland. This incident seemed worse than many of the others which involved the hat, of course, as expected. As well, Joshua ended up biting the guy who stole his hat during this incident, though admittedly at this point Joshua was put into a headlock by the same guy. He was as well at one point told that he was being hunted down by the quote Icelandic mafia, which resulted in another mini freakout. As well, Josh had a large crowd of fans recognize him on his trip to Iceland, in which he was most always swarmed by a huge crowd of people. And of course, many of these people did not exactly have the best intentions in regards to their interactions with him. Though he met a group of guys who seemed to, for the most part, look out for him, of course this trip to Iceland proved to be quite hectic and riddled with constant harassment. It is safe to say that Joshua somehow made a big name for himself in Iceland, and in turn, this resulted in constant fan interactions for better or worse. On this same journey, Joshua made his way back to Paris. The trip was less notable, however, and nothing too out of the ordinary happened on this journey. Of course, as mentioned before, despite the constant harassment that came with his Iceland excursion, Joshua found himself back in the country only a few short weeks later. Many were not sure why this was, as not only was the last trip so recent, but as well consisted of many incidents of harassment. Regardless, for whatever reason, Joshua was inclined to go back for 2 days and relive the experience. Many also suspected that Joshua enjoyed the attention he got in Iceland, essentially being treated as almost a local celebrity, harassment aside. After these trips, Joshua would continue to find himself being the constant target of harassment around New York City as always. For example, around this time Joshua would meet a new character, Mr. Based, a former New York City pimp and present-day IRL live streamer on YouTube. While doing one of his usual tours, Mr. Based would approach Josh and engage with him on the streets. Joshua of course would not take well to this harassment and in turn would snap only a few short seconds into the video, threatening the live streamer to quote scram, followed by his usual lawsuit and quote unemployed blitz lines.
Who are you?
Fucking unemployed brat!
Yes!
Ah,
Who are you? You scream like a bitch!
go away!
Who are you and I'll go?
Go away!
Mr. Based on YouTube!
I'm the king of New York!
I'm the king of New York!
What sets this incident apart from all other ones is that Mr. Bass could be said to be on an equal caliber of craziness as Josh's, and in turn would mirror Josh's behaviors right back at him. This behavior would go on to imitate Josh, and somehow seemingly humble him a little. There was as well a second incident with Mr. Bass that followed a similar premise. This time, Mr. Bass would go on to perform his usual antics with Josh, except this time Josh would splash a cup of beer at him.
I'm walking home. Oh my god! He just threw his drink on me! Alright, now you've got problems, young man.
This in turn aggravated Mr. Bass, and with this saw him chasing Josh up and down the streets in New York City, as Josh tried to run away from the situation. In any case, you get the idea. Joshua would find himself being the subject of constant harassment by those around him, and of course this in turn would only further worsen his situation. This paired with his constant drinking and already pre-existing impulsivity and disabilities would prove to be a dangerous cocktail that would only go to further add to his already raging spiral. Joshua nowadays finds himself living in New York City almost full time, though many have questions regarding his living situation. Joshua rarely, if ever, goes back home to his grandfather's residence, where he lived full time prior to TikTok and while still in school. With this, it's rumored that Josh has a space to sleep in at Michael Quinn's apartment, or that he sleeps on his rooftop. However, many have also suspected that Joshua is sleeping on the streets around the city, either on park benches around town or on public transport. Joshua has admitted to sleeping in Airbnbs when possible. However, of course, this would prove to be reasonably expensive and would mean that Josh is living well above his means. Though it is rumored that Josh makes a surprisingly decent living off of his online doings and cameos alone, as we can tell, money management isn't anything but a skill that Joshua adequately has down. As well, this is further emphasized by the fact that New York City is anything but an inexpensive place to be, let alone to be constantly vacationing in. Whatever the case may be, it becomes crystal clear that Joshua's living situation is anything but stable. As well, Josh is said to lack severely in the department of personal hygiene. Joshua is known for wearing the same exact outfits for oftentimes months at a time, and has even gotten to the point where his lack of hygiene became a genuine point of concern to fans. For example, Joshua at one point wore a pair of shorts so covered in grime that fans grew incredibly concerned. However, Michael Quinn ultimately helped to buy him a new outfit around this time. Besides this, his physical well-being and health is also a huge point of concern to fans as well. Over the past year, so 2022 to 2023 alone, Joshua has visibly aged quite drastically, and it from here becomes evident that he has not been taking great care of himself. Though this is mostly just visual, it of course holds merit, as his lifestyle proves this in stone. Noting his physical health, his alcohol dependence has also noticeably gotten worse over the past year. We know currently that Josh is a heavy drinker, and that he regularly drinks once or twice a day. However, the physical side effects of his drinking have begun to show themselves. For example, many fans have noticed that Joshua gets the shakes whenever he is sober, which is a frequent symptom of alcohol withdrawal among alcoholics due usually to overstimulation. As well, some have even suspected that Joshua is beginning to develop club fingernails off of presumably what has been seen online, though that much is still to be truly confirmed. His lifestyle has also dipped down to such lows that even fans online, many of whom have grown to even resent Josh, have reached out to his family in an effort to stage an intervention. His cousin got a word of a situation and made an attempt to obtain guardianship over Joshua. Upon hearing this, Joshua went on to threaten his cousin and would wish death upon her. Besides this, Joshua's attitude has also greatly declined over this year period. During a more recent hat stealing incident, Joshua was recorded having a public meltdown, screaming and stomping on a random picnic table while being surrounded with a crowd of people recording him and egging him on. During this incident, he would also go on to broadcast himself on live video, drunkenly ranting and claiming that he could never travel or eat out, as he claimed that he, quote, wasn't wealthy. Despite this, of course, Joshua is a known compulsive spender who, when not eating out in New York City, is known to frequently travel. As well, during the year of 2023, Joshua's been on over 8 trips, mostly to European destinations. Many of these locations were already mentioned, but for perspective's sake, Joshua also took trips to Las Vegas, Norway, and Amsterdam during this time. And of course, as previously mentioned, it is highly suspected that these trips were being paid for by a third party, likely Michael Quinn or someone connected to him. In short, Joshua has found himself at the whims of both alcohol and a radical fan base over the past year or so. These two ideas, as have mentioned, proven to be a net negative for Joshua. Many would egg him on to do and say things that would lead to the most entertaining return of content being produced. Though this is absolutely not meant to pose as an excuse for Josh, however, these two things have proven to be detrimental to Josh. Though otherwise annoying or eccentric as he was, Joshua was once a figure who was mostly loved by the TikTok community. However, as time has gone on, things have gotten progressively darker for the young creator. With himself and his fanbase alike growing more and more radical in behavior, this is a concoction that has completely uprooted who Joshua once was. Though many wish that the attitude of the once fun-loving kid that Joshua used to be would make a return, that unfortunately seems very unlikely nowadays. The story of Joshua Block, if anything, proves as a more cautionary tale more than anything else. It goes to show that fame and attention is most certainly not for everyone, and that under the right circumstances, absolutely anyone can fall grips to both addiction and otherwise negative tendencies. With all this being said, if you made it this far, I'd like to thank you for the view. I know that this video is definitely a much longer one than originally anticipated, however, Joshua is an extremely complex character, and there's no real black or white answer as to how he got himself into this condition that he finds himself in today. As well, given how complex and rapidly developing Joshua's story is, it is most certainly likely that I missed a few details on Joshua's story. However, I hope I did an adequate job at highlighting this video's main idea of tracking Joshua's spiral nonetheless. If there are any interesting supplemental details in which you think would add great context to the video, then please feel more than welcome to leave a comment down below. With all this being said, take care and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.